Afternoon, everyone. Today I will be reading some excerpts from a book called The Provincials by E.J. Evans. E.J. Evans was the son of E.J. or Mutt Evans, who was the first Jewish mayor of Durham and also one of the first in the South. He was instrumental during the transitional period of desegregation in Durham and a leader in the South. He deserves to be better known. Also, I will be telling you a little bit about how Durham brought tobacco to town, a little bit about the Dukes, and a little bit about how tobacco founded Duke University. So let's begin. My father always cared about his town, and it seemed that any time money had to be raised, Durham called on him. He was part of that generation that was too young for World War I and too old for World War II. The men left at home to carry the brunt of community work to buttress the war effort. He headed the community chess campaigns. He brought all the hostile groups together to pass the bond issue for the new wings on the white and Negro hospitals, and twice headed the war bond campaign. In 1950, as the new president of the Merchants Association, Dad was invited by the mayor to serve on one of the business representatives on the Citizens for Good Government Committee, a small group of leaders from the business community, labor, and the Negro political group who had recently formed to try to convince better candidates to run for local offices. 2 days before the filing date, the incumbent mayor received a federal appointment, and the key members of the committee began to cast around for a new candidate to replace him. They could agree on no one. Finally, John Wheeler, the president of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank and chairman of the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, asked, "What about Mutt Evans?" The other leaders of the Negro organization at the meeting said, "Evans helped build the Negro hospital, and his store has been the only place where Negroes downtown can get something to eat or use a restroom or try on clothes." My father was the only candidate that all the factions could agree on, but after the meeting, the conservative members of the business group balked endorsing anyone that the Negroes and labor trusted. They decided to run Judge James Patton against my father. He was a Canny Corporation lawyer who had served as chairman of the Democratic Party in Durham before he was ousted by a new labor-Negro coalition several years before. The newspapers announced the potential candidates, and some alarmed members of the Jewish community began calling my father to beg him not to run. They feared that if anything happened in the city, the whites would blame the Jews, and that a divisive campaign might sink into ugly anti-Semitism. He decided to run anyway, on a platform of bringing the city together. But the downtown crowd, of which he ironically was a leader, opposed him vigorously. As Election Day approached, the Public Appeal, a small local paper with a working man's readership, published the fake Protocols of Zion under a headline that suggested Durham was becoming part of a Jewish plot for world domination. The Public Appeal then published an article entitled NAACP Aims, which said that the organization, quote, through communist influence, sought getting addressed in the white press as Mr., Mrs., or Miss, picture publication, their weddings and social activities noted, the designation Negro eliminated from all court and public records so that they can really revel in all sorts of crime from rape to murder and abolish all laws which prohibit Negro children or youths from attending general public schools and universities. It was classic racial politics in the small South. My mother worried about the personal threats, the obscene phone calls, and the wildly scribbled letters. The week before the election, the police set up a 24-hour watch on our house. My memory of that campaign rivets on a tissue-thin pink leaflet showing a photograph of our new house just below big block letters. Do we want a Goldberg or an Evans? What's the difference? They're all alike. The house. Would they do something to our house? Was my father in danger from a campaign that he had told me would be fun? The man who printed the leaflets showed my father a copy. Fortunately, he and other decent people saw to it that the leaflets would never leave the print shop. My father believed that openness and pride were the best political means of combating anti-Semitism, so he printed on his posters, Chairman, Statewide United Jewish Appeal Campaign, and President, Beth El Synagogue. People in the South, he said, respect church work. On Election Day, we came back home in the late afternoon to sweat out the rest of the day. When the radio announcer gave the final results in the mayor's race at 69-61 to 59-16, officially confirming the election results, Dad turned to my mother and kissed her. I told you it would all work out, he said. How does it feel to be the First Lady of Durham? Dad served for 12 years in 6 consecutive 2-year terms through the turbulent 50s when the Supreme Court jolted the South into responsibility and changed all the rules of living. He always tried to guide his town, pleading for respect for the law and the courts, seizing the openings, and bringing his slice of the South through difficult times when whole corners of his universe were turning to demagogues and false prophets for comfort and defiance. The South is filled with quiet heroes who worked skillfully behind the scenes, who understood the levers of change and did what was right because deep inside they knew that the South could go only one way. It seems so inconsequential in retrospect, but the story of the South is written in the first faltering steps in 100 inconsequential towns. My father would be proudest of the first Negro policemen and firemen, the moving of Negroes into supervisory positions in City Hall, and the years he hammered the City Council to build low-cost housing for the poor of both races, leading to the largest federal grant in the South at that time, because Durham could claim to be a pioneer. He worked behind the scenes to settle the first lunch counter demonstration. Did the roof fall in today? He asked the reluctant manager of Woolworths after they served a Coke to their first black student. He badgered the merchants to hire Negro sales personnel, knowing that if all would move together, no one would be hurt, and the community would be better off. He always had respect for the other man's position and would talk and work while some leaders sought momentary advantage by denouncing each other in emotional headlines. There were the usual nasty fights on property taxes and garbage collection and fluoride in the city water. Mr. Mayor, the phone caller said, I'm suing the city for damages because the fluoride has turned my teeth green and is making my heart palpitate. And he answered, that's fine, ma'am, but we're not putting it in for another month. He had his brushes with the Ku Klux Klan, but he kept the threatening letters and phone calls from his family. He never let anyone know about the weekend he and my mother spent in a motel because police informers had reported a bomb plot at a recent Klan meeting. He liked telling the quip of Billy Carmichael, the vice president of the University of North Carolina, that if anybody had told the people that someday the Catholic vice president of the university and the Jewish mayor of Durham would be on the same platform, every sheet in the county would be riding by nightfall. He never held a political grudge because he believed that every man had his reasons, and that surely, if a man disagreed on one issue, he might be with you on the next one. He was not doctrinaire nor wedded to an ideology. He believed in fairness and worked to resolve differences. He always held himself to the broadest vision. Quote, "We can't have a town where 40% of the population is sullen and unhappy. We can be first and show the rest of the South how to do it." Close quote. He conceived the simple idea of a human relations commission made up of leaders of both races as a permanent device to settle disputes and keep the races talking to each other. Letters came from all over the South asking how to do it. It was old-fashioned, the love of a man for his hometown, and it was Southern, the loyalty of a man to place. When my father retired, the Chamber of Commerce honored him with their Man of the Year award at a banquet at which 1,200 people gave him a standing ovation. On the way home after the dinner, he sat quietly in the back seat, lost in thought for a while. He wasn't a sentimental man, at least not outwardly, but when I asked, he confessed, "I guess I was just wishing that Papa and Mama could have been here tonight." So I hope that acquainted you a little bit with Mr. Evans and the crucial work that he did at a crucial time. Now I'm going to go on to the tobacco story. The rest of North Carolina always had considered Durham an unsavory borough. Its air faulted, its life seedy, a brawling, two-fisted factory town without culture or class, bone dry for legal liquor, but flourishing with bootleggers, the kind of place to stay out of on a Saturday night. Yet, fate destined it the site for a historic meeting between General William T. Sherman of the United States Army on the tail end of his infamous March to the Sea and General Joseph E. Johnston of the Army of the Confederate States of America, both of whom had received word of Lee's surrender at Appomattox. They met in a farmhouse called Bennett Place, 4 miles from Durham Station, in a stunning anticlimax to end in official surrender a war that in fact had been ended 2 weeks before. Sherman's army, dismissed from combat, had plundered everything in sight a few years earlier and now flooded into Durham. At the same time, from a Yankee prison in eastern North Carolina, Washington Duke began a 137-mile walk home to a burned-out, devastated farm, where miraculously the plundering soldiers had overlooked a barn full of tobacco. It was enough for a start, and he and his 3 sons, James Buchanan, known as Buck, Benjamin, and Brody, cut it up by hand, bagged it, and traded it for bacon, flour, and whatever else substituted for money in the broken economy. They built a small factory to work in, if you can call a 20 by 30 foot building a factory, and they called it W. Duke, Sons and Company. Other factories in Durham were making snuff, cigars, cheroots, and chewing tobacco, especially Bull Durham, known nationally and internationally. Nobody could compete with the array of tobacco products offered by the Bull. And in 1880, Buck Duke turned to his brother Ben and said, "We're up against a stone wall. We're going to make cigarettes." Cigarettes. Nothing but tobacco rolled in paper, a fad that began in Turkey in the 1830s and spread to Europe after the Crimean War, when English officers picked it up. And roll your own began to crop up in the fancy salons of London. Russian royalty employed peasants to roll cigarettes for them, and immigrants brought the skill to America. The light and flavorful bright leaf from Virginia and the Carolinas, which burned smoothly and smelled almost sweet, already was gaining a foothold for tailor-mades in the northern cities. So how do you start if you are Buck Duke? You search out the people who can roll the best cigarettes in the world, and you bring them to Durham. From New York City, Buck Duke imported 125 Russian and Polish Jews to roll and pack his cigarettes. Most of them were young men, under 25, many with young families, and Duke paid their train fare from New York. What a trip it must have been. Finally, they came into the red clay country of North Carolina, finally to stop in the desperate little town of Durham, a new home and hopefully a better life. The Jews lived mostly in shacks in Hayti, on its street dubbed Yiddish Street. They spoke little English and gawked at the Durham people when they wandered around town, while the Durham people gawked back at the first foreigners many of them had ever seen. The factory day was very long. Early each day, several Jews would gather around dozens of square marble-top tables and deftly twist the long-cut strips of tobacco into slivers of paper, then paste them together with a mixture of flour and water, all the while rolling with just the right touch to form a tight little cylinder. A good man could roll 3 or 4 a minute, 2,500 in a 12-hour day, and the Duke Company paid them 70 cents a thousand, which meant an income of $2 a week. Buck saw what machines were doing for other industries and kept his eyes and ears open. Within a year, he trotted off to Virginia, where he heard that a 22-year-old named James Bonsack had invented a cigarette-making machine which jammed the tobacco through an endless tube of paper into a circular knife which cut it cleanly. Buck tied up the patents and brought Bonsack to Durham to install the machine. For 14 months, Bonsack and his mechanics tried to perfect the screeching gearbox and the spidery arms on the cutter. And then it happened. The machine began to work for several hours at a time without breaking down, and Buck reduced the work requirements of the hand rollers to 1,000 cigarettes a day and cut their wages to $2.90 a week. It was an untenable position, and the Jews were driven out, the losing side in an early drama of the Industrial Revolution. Once perfected, the Bonsack machine could produce 250,000 cigarettes a day, reducing the cost to 30 cents a thousand and the cost of a pack from 10 cents to a nickel. With the end of the hand-rolled cigarette, the Jews who had come to Durham soon scattered, some to stay in the South as peddlers, but most to return to the North. Buck was a public relations genius. He conceived the sliding box to protect the unsmoked sticks in a gentleman's pocket and never held back on business-boosting advertising schemes, no matter how wild he called his cigarette Duke of Durham and enclosed pictures of luscious actresses in each pack. He hired women to sell on the road to break down the resistance of the store owners. He gave free packs to the immigrants on Ellis Island because he knew they'd carry the word throughout the nation. He sent his salesmen to plaster billboards and fences from London to Shanghai, transporting cigarettes by medieval ox cart and camel caravan to little villages all over the world. Buck didn't mind the barroom tactics of the clashing marketplace, and he paid off the shippers, hired a private police squad to enforce agreements, slashed prices to drive out a competitor, paid off suppliers to bury a rival. Anything he had to do to push Duke of Durham out front. He schemed and slashed his way until he was ready in 1890 for the boldest move of all, to follow in the footsteps of his hero, John D. Rockefeller, and organize a trust in tobacco, just as Rockefeller had done with Standard Oil. He called it the American Tobacco Company, the tobacco trust that grew to dominate tobacco, all of it, smoking, snuff, plug, fine cut, cigars, cheroots, cigarettes, gobbling up even Bull Durham itself as one of the 250 companies and plants that were either absorbed or driven out of business by the giant combine. Buck was 35 years old and a multi-millionaire. Then the trouble started. The churches, the women's bazaars, the boys' clubs, and the physicians attacked the morality and health aspects of smoking cigarettes, and trust-busting populist editors like Josephus Daniels in Raleigh called him Buccaneer Duke for driving down the price of tobacco to the farmer, for fixing prices, and roughhousing competitors. Back in Durham, old Washington Duke turned to charity. Some said to win back the favors of his hometown. Others thought it altruism, but most agreed he was concerned with the Duke name and how it would be remembered. In picking Durham as the subject of his charity, Washington Duke selected a dirty-faced child. When Durham offered twice the money of any other town in the state for the Baptist Female University, the trustees rejected the offer and selected Raleigh because, quote, Durham was lacking in culture, possessed of sordid ideals, and was therefore no fit place for innocent girls to abide in, even though surrounded by college walls. The loss of the Baptist Female University stung the town and angered Washington Duke and his son Ben. When they heard the Methodists were thinking of moving Trinity College from the isolation of Western North Carolina, Ben convinced his father to donate $85,000 if it would come to Durham. It did in 1893, and that was a lot of money for 1893. Some say I ought to give my money to feed poor folks, Wash Duke said, but if I give it to them, they will soon eat it up. I'd rather give my money to make some people who will feed themselves. Age was creeping up on the tough old tobacco trader, and he began to muse about his money. I was born in North Carolina, and I am 64 years old, he told a reporter. It's time to think about a monument I want to leave, something in the state that 500 years from now, people can look and say, Duke did that. Every man owes something to the state he was born in. President William Few, the mild-mannered president at Trinity College, went to see Ben Duke, who personally had supported Trinity with gifts for 20 years. Ben called on Buck and urged him to listen to Few's ideas about a vast university equal to the best in America. Ultimately, the Duke family gave $40 million, and Trinity College changed its name to Duke University. In the center of the campus, they put a statue of Buck, who, while he posed, according to Durham legend, ordered the sculptor to put a cigar in his hand. When a few trustees complained it wasn't dignified, Buck replied, I made my money in tobacco, and I don't want anyone out here to forget it. A member of the last class to graduate from Trinity remembered the valedictory address when the valedictorian raised his arms to the assembled faculty and spoke out in dramatic clarity, and so, my friends, inhale and farewell. The end. I hope you enjoyed those stories. And this is an interesting book. It has a lot of information about Durham in the 40s and 50s. I wish I could have read some more of it, but I think it's too long for a read, especially when you're not present in the auditorium. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it.